She told her staff the new tenant frightened her. He had moved into her building only weeks before, a polite young man with a fake name and too many questions. And an 82-year-old woman who had survived in Manhattan for decades looked at him and said something the court would later record word for word. She said, "He smells like jail." A few days later, Irene Silverman vanished from her own mansion in the middle of one of the most watched cities on Earth. No body, no blood, no crime scene at all. Just an empty townhouse worth almost $8 million, two strangers living inside it under names that were not theirs, and a mother and son who had come to New York to steal a dead woman's home before she was even gone. History remembers the lone killers, the famous names, the mugshots we all recognize. But underneath every headline there are pages no one wanted you to read, the people who don't kill out of rage or madness but out of paperwork, out of patience, out of greed dressed up in a good coat. This is Buried Pages. Tonight, a mother and her son who conned their way across America for 30 years, and the 82-year-old woman who saw exactly what they were and could not make anyone listen in time. To understand what happened in that townhouse, you have to understand the woman who planned it. Her name was Sante Kimes, though even that is uncertain. She told so many versions of where she came from and who she had been that the truth of her own origin is genuinely lost. She built her identity the way she built everything else, out of whatever story was useful that day. What is not in doubt is what she became. By the time she was an adult, Sante Kimes was a professional criminal in the oldest, quietest sense of the word. She was a forger. She was a thief. She was, by the record, an arsonist who learned that a burning building could be turned into an insurance check. She moved through expensive hotels and wealthy circles, and she took what she could, and she moved on before the bill came due. She found her way to a wealthy man, a motel developer worth millions, and attached herself to his life. And in 1975, she had the son who would become the other half of this story. His name was Kenneth Kimes, Kenny. He was not born a killer. He was raised into one. He grew up inside his mother's schemes, learning her trade the way other children learn a family business. The false names, the forged documents, the art of looking respectable while robbing the room. And there is one chapter from those years that tells you exactly how far Sante Kimes was willing to go. In the middle of the 1980s, she was convicted in federal court of something most people never associate with a woman in furs and jewelry. She had been keeping young immigrant women as unpaid servants in her homes, luring them in, taking their documents, and controlling them through fear and the threat of deportation. It was prosecuted as a form of slavery. She served roughly 3 years in federal prison for it. This was not a woman who slipped once into crime. This was a way of seeing other people. To Sante Kimes, the human beings around her were not people. They were resources, things to be used until they were used up. And here is the detail that captures her completely. Sante was a relentless social climber and a shameless crasher of important events. She would talk her way into galas and parties she had no business attending, and she made certain to be photographed standing beside powerful and famous people, politicians, celebrities, anyone whose importance she could borrow for a moment. To Sante, a photograph with the right person was not a memory. It was a tool, a prop she could show the next person she wanted to deceive, a proof that she belonged, that she was respectable, that she was safe. She understood, long before most criminals ever do, that the easiest way to rob people is to first convince them that you are exactly the kind of person who never would. By the 1990s, the mother and the son had become something rare and dangerous. Not a boss and a follower. A team. They traveled together, checked into hotels together, ran their cons together, and to the people they targeted, they were disarming precisely because of what they appeared to be. Who suspects a well-dressed older woman and her devoted grown son? The relationship itself was the disguise. Their bond was the alibi. And here the story moves into territory we have to be careful with, because investigators came to believe the Kimeses left more than ruined finances behind them. They believed they left bodies. By the middle of the 1990s, Sante had moved money into offshore accounts in the Bahamas, and a banker there named Sid Bilal Ahmed had come to handle some of it. In 1996, he was in a position to know too much about where that money had really come from. And then on the islands, he simply disappeared. Years later, by Kenny's own account, the two of them had drugged the banker and made certain his body was never found. No one was ever charged for it. But the story Kenny told fit the pattern exactly, a person who became inconvenient, erased, as if he had never existed at all. There was also a man in Hawaii, hired to help with one of her insurance fires, who likewise vanished. We have to be honest and precise about these. No one was ever charged with either death. They live in the gap between what investigators believe and what a court ever proved. But they tell you the direction this was heading. The cons were escalating. The stakes were rising. And the Kimeses had learned that the most permanent way to silence a problem was to make the person holding it disappear. That truth caught up with a man named David Kazdin in the spring of 1998. Kazdin was not a victim chosen at random. He was an old associate of Sante's, a businessman in Los Angeles who had known her for years. And he had just discovered something that made him very dangerous to her. Sante had used his name. She had forged David Kazdin's signature on loan documents to pull roughly $280,000 out of a property, and Kazdin had found out. Think about how small the trigger is here. Not a fortune, not a betrayal of the heart, a signature. He had learned that his name was on a piece of paper it should never have been on, and he was angry and he was going to say so. To most people, that is a lawsuit, a furious phone call, a problem for the lawyers. To Sante Kimes, it was a loose end. And by now, the family had a way of dealing with loose ends. In March of 1998, David Kazdin was shot in the head. His body was found in a dumpster near the Los Angeles airport. Years later, Kenny would admit that he was the one who pulled the trigger, and that he had recruited a man from a homeless shelter to help him get rid of the body. A 63-year-old man was murdered and thrown away like trash because he objected to his own name being stolen. But the killing of David Kazdin was the past catching up with them. What the Kimeses were planning next was something far more ambitious and far stranger. They were not going to steal money this time. They were going to steal a building, and the woman who lived inside it. On the Upper East Side of Manhattan, at 20 East 65th Street, there was a magnificent townhouse. It belonged to Irene Silverman, 82 years old, a former dancer, a widow, a sharp and independent woman who rented out elegant apartments inside her own mansion. The house was worth nearly $8 million, and Sante Kimes had decided she was going to take it not by buying it, but by forging the paperwork that said she already owned it. The plan was breathtaking in its nerve. In June of 1998, Kenny rented one of the apartments in Silverman's house, using the false name Manny Guerin. His mother quietly moved in with him, and from inside, the two of them went to work. They planted listening devices to monitor the old woman's movements. They began assembling forged documents, a deed, a will, papers designed to transfer ownership of the townhouse to a company they controlled. The idea was as cold as anything in this entire case. Make the rightful owner disappear and walk in holding paperwork that said the house had been theirs all along. But Irene Silverman was nobody's fool. She had run this building for years, and she had a feel for people, and almost from the start, something about her new tenant unsettled her. According to the court record, she was immediately suspicious of him. She told her staff she did not trust him. She cut a vacation short because she was uneasy about having him in her house. She asked her building manager to write a letter telling Manny to leave. And in a phrase the court preserved, she told her employees exactly what her instincts were screaming. He smells like jail. She was right. She was completely right, and it was not enough to save her. On July 5, 1998, Irene Silverman was last seen by one of her employees. By that evening, she was gone. There was no sign of a struggle that anyone could point to. There was no body. An 82-year-old woman had simply ceased to exist inside her own home, in a townhouse full of staff and tenants and security in the middle of Manhattan. But the Kimeses had made one fatal miscalculation. Even as the Silverman plot was unfolding, the police in Los Angeles had been working the David Kazdin murder, and the trail from that killing led to Sante and Kenny. On that very same day, July 5th, federal agents and New York detectives arrested the mother and son, and then they opened the car. What they found is the reason this case has never been forgotten. Inside the vehicle and their luggage was, in effect, a murderer's toolkit. There were documents in Irene Silverman's name. There were blank legal forms, a will, a deed ready to be filled in. There were notebooks, page after page, detailing the plan against her. There were handcuffs. There was a stun gun box. There were sedatives and a can of mace and rubber gloves and black garbage bags. There was a loaded handgun and roughly $30,000 in cash. And in the trunk, there was an empty duffel bag. The court described it plainly, large enough to hold the body of a 6-foot-tall person. They had not just imagined the crime. They had packed for it. Stop for a moment here and sit with what this case actually is. We tend to imagine murderers as people who lose control. A flash of rage, a moment of panic, something human, however terrible, that breaks loose and does the unthinkable. But there was nothing out of control about Sante and Kenny Kimes. This was not rage. This was administration. They studied a woman. They moved into her home. They wrote down the plan in notebooks. They packed the gloves and the bags and the sedatives the way you would pack for a trip. They treated the ending of a human life as a logistical step in a real estate transaction. That is what makes this story so cold and so frightening. Not that they were monsters in some obvious, snarling way, but that they were so calm. To them, Irene Silverman was never a person. She was an obstacle standing between them and a house. And the most chilling part is that she knew. She felt it. She said it out loud. She looked at the man living under her roof and told the people around her that he smelled like jail. And a city full of locks and guards and good intentions still could not keep her safe from two people with a plan and no conscience. When the case went to trial in New York, the prosecution faced a problem that should have been impossible. There was no body. Irene Silverman has never been found to this day, and in most people's minds, you cannot convict someone of murder without a victim to point to. No body, no crime. That is exactly what the Kimeses were counting on. But the prosecution built something else, a wall of circumstantial evidence so complete that the absence of a body almost stopped mattering. The notebooks, the forged documents, the false names, the eavesdropping equipment, the murder kit in the trunk. The fact that an independent, healthy woman had vanished without a trace from her own locked home, precisely as two strangers prepared to seize it. The court would later make a point of this case as an example of a powerful truth. That circumstantial evidence, when there is enough of it, can paint a picture of guilt even sharper than an eyewitness. In the year 2000, Sante and Kenneth Kimes were convicted of the murder of Irene Silverman, along with more than 100 other counts. Robbery, burglary, conspiracy, forgery, grand larceny. They were each sentenced to an aggregate of about 120 years in prison. A murder conviction with no body, one on evidence alone. And even then, the story was not finished, because there was still the matter of David Kazdin, waiting in California, a case that carried the death penalty. In October of 2000, while he was already convicted and locked inside a maximum security prison, Kenny did something almost no one saw coming. During an interview with a television producer, he suddenly grabbed her, pressed a ballpoint pen against her throat, and refused to let go. For more than 4 hours, inside a prison full of guards, he held a hostage, and the thing he demanded was not freedom for himself. It was that his mother not be sent to California, where the Kazdin case was waiting with the possibility of a death sentence. Even then, even from inside a cell, Kenny Kimes was still trying to protect his mother. The producer was finally freed, unharmed, and the standoff ended. But it showed just how total the bond between these two still was, which is what makes what happened next so hard to believe. And then something broke between them. Faced with the death penalty in the Kazdin case, Kenny made a choice that Sante never saw coming. He turned on her. He agreed to confess and to testify against his own mother in exchange for both of them being spared execution. It was Kenny who finally described what had happened to Irene Silverman, how the old woman had been overpowered and killed, and her body hidden where it has never been recovered. The son who had once held a hostage to save his mother now sat in a courtroom and helped to bury her, in every way that was left. In 2004, Sante Kimes was convicted of David Kazdin's murder as well. The judge who sentenced her called her one of the most evil people she had ever seen in a courtroom. Sante Kimes never expressed remorse. She maintained her innocence and her performance to the very end. On the 19th of May, 2014, she was found dead in her cell at a New York prison. She was 79 years old. She died as she had lived, telling her own version of the story. Kenny remains in prison to this day. It is tempting to file Sante Kimes away as a monster and leave it there. But the buried pages in this case are not really about how evil she was. They are about how ordinary the machinery of it looked right up until the end. A forged signature, a false name on a lease, a polite young man asking questions about an old woman's house. None of it looked like murder. That was the entire point. The Kimeses understood something most criminals never grasp, that the most effective disguise is not a mask, but respectability. A good coat, a confident voice, a mother and her son who could not possibly be what they were. And in the middle of it all, there is Irene Silverman, 82 years old, sharp to the very last, sensing the danger in her own home and saying so plainly to anyone who would listen. He smells like jail. She read them perfectly. She just could not prove it in time. And the cruelest page in this whole story is that her instincts were sound, her warning was clear, and the world simply was not built to act on a frightened old woman's certainty until it was already too late. That's the page most people skip, not how clever the con was, but how loudly the truth was spoken before anyone was willing to hear it. And it is exactly the kind of page we will keep digging up here on Buried Pages. If this story held you, stay with us, because the next one is already waiting to be uncovered.